Picture this scenario that might sound eerily familiar. You're dealing with someone who never raises their voice, never throws objects, never creates obvious drama. Instead, they operate through a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation that leaves you questioning your own sanity. These individuals have mastered the art of emotional warfare through subtle tactics that traditional conflict resolution simply cannot address. The most devastating aspect of these encounters isn't the obvious confrontation you might expect. Rather, it's the carefully orchestrated campaign of microaggressions, strategic silences, and calculated responses designed to destabilize your emotional foundation. When you attempt to address these behaviors directly, you're often met with innocent confusion, as if your concerns are completely unfounded or exaggerated beyond reasonable measure. Consider the workplace dynamic, where a colleague consistently undermines your contributions through seemingly harmless comments. They might say something like, "Interesting approach," with a tone that suggests anything but genuine interest. Or they'll ask questions that appear supportive but actually highlight potential weaknesses in your proposals. These tactics are particularly insidious because they operate within the boundaries of acceptable professional behavior while systematically eroding your confidence and credibility. The family member who weaponizes concern represents another common manifestation of this psychological manipulation. They express worry about your choices, your relationships, your career decisions, but their concern always comes wrapped in subtle criticisms that plant seeds of doubt about your judgment. They position themselves as the voice of reason while systematically undermining your sense of autonomy and self-trust. Perhaps most damaging is the romantic partner who transforms love into a control mechanism. They don't forbid you from seeing friends or pursuing interests. Instead, they create emotional consequences that make these activities feel selfish or inconsiderate. They master the art of making you feel guilty for prioritizing anything other than their emotional needs, effectively isolating you through your own sense of responsibility and care. The exhaustion you experience after these interactions isn't coincidental or a sign of weakness. It's the natural result of engaging in psychological combat, where the rules are constantly shifting and your emotional responses are being carefully catalogued and weaponized against you. You leave these encounters feeling drained because you've been fighting a battle where victory was never a possibility within the established parameters. This pattern creates a dangerous cycle where your natural empathy and desire for harmony become the very tools used to manipulate and control you. The more you attempt to understand their perspective, the more material you provide for future manipulation. The more you try to maintain peace, the more you enable behaviors that systematically destroy your emotional well-being and mental health. The Renaissance political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli understood that power dynamics rarely involve obvious displays of force. True control operates through psychological manipulation, strategic positioning, and the ability to predict and influence human behavior. When applied to personal relationships, these principles reveal why traditional approaches to conflict resolution often fail when dealing with individuals who have no genuine interest in resolution or mutual understanding. The fundamental error most people make is assuming that toxic individuals want the same things from relationships that healthy people want. They approach these interactions believing that enough explanation, enough patience, enough understanding will eventually lead to positive change. This assumption becomes the foundation of their continued manipulation and emotional exploitation. Toxic individuals don't seek understanding in the way emotionally healthy people do. Their primary objective is to maintain a psychological advantage that allows them to predict and control your responses. Every piece of information you provide about your emotional state, your insecurities, your triggers, becomes data they can use to maintain their position of control within the relationship dynamic. The moment you begin to recognize these patterns, you're faced with a choice that will fundamentally alter the trajectory of your relationships and your life. You can continue operating under the assumption that kindness and understanding will eventually transform these dynamics, or you can acknowledge that some individuals have no interest in the kind of relationship you're trying to create and adjust your strategy accordingly. The first strategic principle involves recognizing that your emotional reactions are not spontaneous responses to unreasonable behavior. They are the intended outcome of carefully calculated actions designed to provoke specific responses that serve the manipulator's psychological needs. When you understand this, you begin to see these interactions not as relationship conflicts, but as psychological experiments where your reactions are being studied and catalogued. Strategic silence represents a complete reversal of the traditional approach to relationship conflict. Instead of rushing to explain your position, justify your actions, or seek understanding, you create space that disrupts their ability to predict and control your responses. This isn't passive-aggressive behavior or emotional withdrawal. It's a deliberate strategic choice that removes their primary source of psychological fuel. When someone makes a cutting remark designed to provoke defensiveness, the strategic response isn't to defend yourself or to ignore the comment completely. Instead, you acknowledge what was said without providing the emotional reaction they were seeking. A simple, "I understand that's your perspective," removes their ability to escalate the situation while maintaining your dignity and composure. The power of this approach becomes apparent when you observe how people respond to your refusal to engage in their established patterns. Those who genuinely care about your well-being will respect your boundaries and adjust their approach accordingly. Those who are primarily interested in maintaining psychological control will often escalate their tactics in an attempt to force you back into familiar response patterns. This escalation phase is crucial to understand because it represents their unconscious acknowledgement that their previous tactics are no longer effective. They may become more direct in their criticism, more obvious in their manipulation attempts, or they may shift to guilt-based tactics designed to make you feel responsible for the change in dynamic. The establishment of clear boundaries represents the second major strategic element in reclaiming your psychological autonomy. However, boundaries in this context are not requests or negotiations. They are unilateral decisions about what you will and will not accept in your relationships, backed by consistent enforcement regardless of the other person's response or approval. Consider the difference between saying, "I would prefer if you didn't call me after 9 p.m. versus, "I don't answer my phone after 9 p.m. The first statement is a request that invites negotiation, explanation, and potential compromise. The second statement is a clear boundary that doesn't require the other person's agreement or understanding to be valid and enforceable. The enforcement of boundaries often reveals the true nature of relationships that may have appeared healthy on the surface. When you stop accommodating unreasonable requests or accepting disrespectful treatment, you discover which people in your life were genuinely interested in mutual respect and which were primarily benefiting from your lack of clear limits. This process can be particularly challenging because it often involves people who have been in your life for extended periods, including family members, long-term friends, or romantic partners. The difficulty of enforcing boundaries with these individuals often stems from the assumption that length of relationship should influence your willingness to accept poor treatment. However, the duration of a relationship has no bearing on whether specific behaviors are acceptable or healthy. A family member who has been manipulative for 20 years is still engaging in manipulative behavior. A friend who has been taking advantage of your generosity for a decade is still taking advantage of your generosity. Time doesn't transform problematic behavior into acceptable behavior. The third strategic element involves what could be called the disappearing act, but it's more accurately described as strategic disengagement. This approach involves reducing your availability for manipulation without announcing your intentions or providing explanations that could be used to guilt you back into previous patterns of interaction. When toxic individuals realize they're losing their ability to provoke predictable responses, they often intensify their efforts through what appears to be vulnerability or crisis. They may suddenly need your help with urgent problems, experience health scares that require your immediate attention, or create relationship emergencies that seem to demand your involvement. These crisis situations often represent escalation tactics designed to override your newly established boundaries by appealing to your sense of compassion and responsibility. The timing of these crises, occurring just as you've begun to establish healthier relationship dynamics, is rarely coincidental. Strategic disengagement involves maintaining your boundaries, even when presented with apparent emergencies or crises. This doesn't mean you become indifferent to genuine suffering, but rather that you recognize the difference between authentic requests for support and manipulative attempts to regain psychological control. The fourth strategic element focuses on communication that cannot be misinterpreted, manipulated, or turned against you. This involves developing a vocabulary of responses that are clear, direct, and immune to the kind of parsing and reinterpretation that toxic individuals often employ to maintain confusion and conflict. Instead of lengthy explanations that provide material for future arguments, effective communication with manipulative individuals requires what could be called precision language. Each statement should be complete in itself, not dependent on their understanding or agreement, and resistant to misinterpretation or manipulation. When someone attempts to engage you in an argument by making inflammatory statements, responding with something like, "I can see you feel strongly about this," acknowledges their statement without agreeing, disagreeing, or providing fuel for further conflict. It's a complete response that doesn't invite continuation of the destructive pattern. The effectiveness of this approach becomes apparent when you observe how difficult it becomes for others to create the kind of prolonged conflicts that previously characterized your interactions. Without your participation in lengthy justifications or defensive responses, their attempts at manipulation lose their effectiveness and often simply fade away. The fifth strategic element involves developing what could be called emotional immunity. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent, but rather about developing the ability to observe manipulative behavior without being emotionally destabilized by it. When you can recognize manipulation tactics as they're happening, you're much less likely to respond in ways that reinforce the toxic dynamic. This emotional stability often develops naturally as you implement the other strategic elements, but it can also be cultivated through practices that strengthen your sense of self-worth and emotional autonomy. When you have a clear understanding of your own values and boundaries, other people's opinions and manipulations have less power to disturb your equilibrium. The development of emotional immunity also involves recognizing that other people's emotional states are not your responsibility to manage or fix. This can be particularly challenging for individuals who have been socialized to prioritize others' comfort over their own well-being, but it's essential for maintaining healthy relationship dynamics. When someone is upset about your boundaries or frustrated by your refusal to engage in familiar patterns, their emotional response is information about their expectations and priorities, not a judgment on the validity of your choices. Your responsibility is to maintain your boundaries consistently, not to manage their emotional response to your boundaries. The sixth strategic element involves establishing what could be called personal laws or non-negotiable principles that guide your relationships regardless of external pressure or manipulation. These aren't rules you impose on others, but rather principles that govern your own behavior and responses in various situations. For example, you might establish a personal law that you don't engage in conversations where you're being yelled at or spoken to disrespectfully. This doesn't mean you try to control other people's behavior, but rather that you remove yourself from situations where your own principles are being violated. The other person can choose to behave however they want, but they can't choose to have access to you while behaving in ways you've determined are unacceptable. These personal laws serve as a kind of operating system for your relationships, providing clear guidelines for how you respond to various situations without requiring extensive analysis or emotional processing in the moment. When you have clear principles established in advance, you can respond to manipulation attempts quickly and consistently without being drawn into lengthy internal debates about the appropriate response. The enforcement of these personal laws often requires what might seem like harsh or inflexible responses. But this perception usually comes from people who were benefiting from your previous flexibility and accommodation of unreasonable behavior. Those who respect your well-being will typically adapt to your boundaries without requiring extensive explanation or justification. The seventh and perhaps most challenging strategic element involves the willingness to end relationships that cannot be transformed into healthy dynamics despite your best efforts. This doesn't necessarily mean dramatic confrontations or detailed explanations, but rather a quiet withdrawal of your energy and attention from relationships that consistently drain rather than nurture you. The decision to end a relationship, whether temporarily or permanently, often brings up intense feelings of guilt, particularly when the other person appears to be suffering as a result. However, it's important to distinguish between genuine consequences of relationship changes and manipulative displays designed to guilt you back into previous patterns. Someone who has been benefiting from an unhealthy dynamic will often experience genuine distress when that dynamic changes. But their distress doesn't invalidate your right to establish healthier boundaries. Their adjustment difficulties are not your responsibility to solve, particularly if solving them requires you to return to relationships patterns that were harmful to your well-being. The process of distancing yourself from toxic relationships often reveals how much energy you were investing in managing other people's emotions and reactions. As you withdraw this energy and redirect it toward your own growth and well-being, you may be surprised by how much mental and emotional capacity you have available for positive pursuits. This redistribution of energy often leads to improvements in other areas of your life as well. When you're not constantly managing toxic relationships, you have more energy available for work, creative pursuits, healthy relationships, and personal development. The contrast can be striking enough to reinforce your commitment to maintaining healthier relationship boundaries. The implementation of these strategies doesn't happen overnight, nor does it require perfect execution from the beginning. Like any skill, the ability to recognize and respond effectively to manipulation tactics develops with practice and experience. The key is to begin implementing these approaches consistently, even in small ways, rather than waiting until you feel completely confident or prepared. Each time you choose not to engage with manipulative behavior, you're reinforcing your own sense of autonomy and self-respect. Each time you maintain a boundary despite pressure to abandon it, you're demonstrating to yourself that your well-being matters. These small victories accumulate over time into significant changes in how others perceive and treat you. The most profound realization that often comes from implementing these strategies is that many relationships you thought were essential to your happiness were actually significant sources of stress and emotional depletion. When you remove these toxic dynamics from your life, you create space for relationships and activities that genuinely contribute to your growth and well-being. This transformation doesn't make you cold or uncaring. Instead, it allows you to direct your care and energy toward people and situations where it can actually make a positive difference. When you stop trying to fix people who have no interest in changing, you become available to support those who are genuinely working toward growth and positive change. The journey towards psychological freedom from toxic relationships requires courage, consistency, and a willingness to disappoint people who have become accustomed to your accommodation of their unreasonable behavior. It's not an easy path, but it's one that leads to authentic self-respect and genuinely fulfilling relationships. As you begin to implement these strategies, you'll likely notice that some people in your life respond positively to your increased clarity and consistency. These are often individuals who were also uncomfortable with previous toxic dynamics but didn't know how to address them effectively. Your modeling of healthy boundaries can sometimes inspire others to establish better boundaries in their own lives. However, you'll also encounter people who react negatively to any change in the dynamics that previously favored them. Their resistance to your growth isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's confirmation that the previous dynamics were indeed problematic and needed to change. The ultimate goal of these strategies isn't to manipulate others or to win conflicts, but rather to create space in your life for authentic, respectful relationships while protecting yourself from those who have no genuine interest in your well-being. When you stop participating in toxic relationship patterns, you're not just protecting yourself, you're also refusing to enable behavior that ultimately harms everyone involved. Remember that implementing these strategies is not about becoming perfect or never making mistakes in your relationships. It's about developing the skills and awareness necessary to recognize manipulation when it occurs and to respond in ways that protect your psychological well-being while maintaining your integrity and self-respect. The transformation that comes from mastering these approaches extends far beyond your relationships with obviously toxic individuals. It affects how you show up in all your relationships, how you handle professional challenges, and how you navigate the various social situations that make up daily life. When you operate from a foundation of clear boundaries and self-respect, every interaction becomes an opportunity to reinforce these positive changes. So which of these 7 strategic approaches will you begin implementing in the next 24 hours? Choose one specific strategy that resonates with your current situation and commit to applying it consistently, even in small ways. Share your choice in the comments below, and let's create a community of people committed to breaking free from toxic relationship patterns and building lives based on genuine respect and authentic connection.